This is the Bass Guitar Worship Blender Podcast. Welcome to the Bass Guitar Worship Blender Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Haseker. You've never heard of me before, and that's okay, because I've never heard of you before either. But that's okay. We can be friends, and we can enjoy our time together. I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what this podcast will be, since this is the first episode. I'm a bass player, and obviously, I've been playing bass with my church worship team for about 5.5 years. It's a small little church in a small little town of Crystal River, Florida. Although we've got a pretty good sized church for our area. We've got about 600, 700, 800 people in our congregation on a average Sunday. And I got involved I've been in music all my life, but I got involved with the church later in life. I didn't get saved till about 5.5 years ago, right before I ended up getting involved with a church and then playing on the worship team. And so this podcast is basically a lot about my experiences, but I don't want it to be just about me. Praise God, I do not want it to be just about me. I want to really involve other people as much as possible into this podcast. Now, when I'm listening to other podcasts, since I'm a bass player, I want to learn more about playing bass. And so one of the areas is, hey, I've got a long commute to work every day, so I seek out podcasts that I can listen to. And the bass podcast, it's kind of hard finding a bass podcast where they're really talking about the bass. A lot of times, there's some good podcasts out there, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times it's interviews with bass players or even people who aren't bass players, and they're talking about a lot of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the bass guitar. And so I'm hoping that this podcast will be more about not just interviews with people, which I do want to have that because that's cool, but it'll actually be about things that you can use and apply to your own playing on a church platform. So I want to talk about technique. I want to talk about theory. I want to talk about ways that you can improve your playing. And I also want to talk about gear too, because we love talking about gear. That's always a fun thing to talk about. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about gear. I also want to make this podcast where it's not just me talking. I mentioned interviews. Yeah, of course, we want to have interviews with people, but also want to be able to find ways of making it more of a community instead of just me up here blabbering into a microphone, because there's probably only going to be so much of that you're going to be able to handle, myself included. So I want to get you involved in this podcast.
Who is this hack? Episode 1 of the Bass Guitar Worship Blender Podcast.
Hi, my name is Brent Haseker, and I am the one that is hosting this podcast. And you're probably wondering, who is this hack? Who's this guy that thinks he's good enough to do a bass podcast? Well, to be honest, I really don't think that I'm good enough to pretend to be any kind of expert or anything like that, because I'm not. I consider myself an average, everyday bass player. But I also feel like I do have some interesting things that I bring to the mix, because my background's probably a little different than some bass players. So I figured what I'll do for this first podcast is I'll kind of give you a history of who I am, introduce myself so you get to know me. And I hope that in no way that this introduction comes off as vain or anything like that. I definitely don't want that to be the case, but just to help you know who I am, because I definitely want to know more about the listeners to this podcast. I want to be able to meet people through this podcast and be able to also help bring other people up. Even if you're a better bass player than me, I want to bring you up to a higher level. If you're not as good a bass player as me, I want to bring you up to my level or above. So this podcast is really, it's not about me pretending to be this great bass player. It's really about helping all of us kind of working together and building each other up. I'll be honest, I'm looking for somebody to mentor me, and I'm also looking for people to mentor myself. And so I'll go ahead and give you a background of who I am. So really it all starts out going back to when I was 9 years old, or actually probably a little earlier than that. Well, I'll be honest, I'm 47 now, so I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm also, I'm not old. So when I was a kid, second grade, I was sleeping over at my friend Stan's house. And we were, I don't know, playing with Legos or something like that. And Stan's mom said, "Stan, it's time for you to practice your piano." "Oh, Mom, I don't want to." And I thought, wow, you play the piano? I had no idea. And so he went over to the piano and sat down and started playing. And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. I had no idea you could do this. And wow, look at what you're doing. This is really cool. So I thought that was just a great, cool thing. And I just couldn't believe how good my friend Stan was on the piano. And so I was all excited about it. And and of course I had to have him teach me something. And when my mom picked me up, it was a sleepover. So when my mom picked me up the next day, I said, "Mom, I want a piano. I want to learn how to play the piano like Stan." And for a while, my mom thought, this is just my son just thinking, it's just a phase. It's nothing. But I guess I must have kept pestering her about it, because at some point she went out and bought a piano for us. It was a beat up old used upright piano for a couple $100, I think. My parents got it for. I guess they didn't really think I was going to be really serious about it. So they didn't spend a lot of money on a piano. This was back in the days before they had, small little portable keyboards and things like that. This would have been, I guess, late 70s. So if you wanted to play piano, you had to go out and buy a piano. You didn't have small little Casios and stuff at that time. Although they did come out shortly after that, because I remember getting a small Casio at some point later on. But anyway, so I started taking piano lessons when I was 9 years old, formal lessons. So that meant going to a piano teacher and learning classical music and reading sheet music and learning proper technique. And I played classical music with these piano instructions for really up until I was about 17, 18 years old, graduating from high school. So I had a lot of years studying piano. Now, piano, you don't really study when you're taking formal piano lessons with classical music. At least with my teacher, we weren't studying theory and harmony and all that stuff. We were really focusing on learning songs off of sheet music. So that meant memorizing some very complex pieces, knowing every single note of the song, knowing how to play with dynamics, knowing the proper technique. So even though I didn't learn a lot about theory at that time, I definitely learned a lot about performance and about using proper technique, which has really stuck with me through the years and has definitely helped me out a lot. And so even though I'm a self-taught bass player, coming from a background of proper technique has allowed me to kind of seek out what are the best methods to, what's the proper technique on the bass. Although I probably still got a few areas, since I've never had formal training on the bass, where I've still got to work out a few little things. And plus I've got a few, which I'll share later, some unique things that I probably do as far as my technique, but we'll get into that later. So 9 years old, I started playing piano. As I started to become a teenager, I don't know exactly what year, would it, I guess, been around 84. Bryan Adams came out with his Reckless album, and the Run to You video came out on MTV, and I thought, oh, that's awesome. That's what I want to be, a musician. So up to that point, playing the piano was just because it was fun. I wanted to do it. But at that Bryan Adams video was kind of my Beatles moment where I thought, yeah, I want to be a musician. So of course, since he played a guitar, I tried to take some forays into trying to figure out how to play guitar, and that was not very successful. I play very mildly on guitar. I can fake it in the studio and write parts, but really I'm not a good guitar player at all. So I did some trying out on guitar. That didn't really work. So I continued to stick with keyboard. Even though I had that guitar envy, I played in a lot of bands as a keyboard player. Starting out in my teens, I was playing in bar bands and things like that when I was still underage. So I was, they were sneaking me in so that I could play keyboards in these bands. And then in my junior year, after my junior year of high school, for the summer, Berklee College of Music had a 5-week summer program. I remember going there for that 5-week summer program, just absolutely loving it. That was the first time really getting exposed to a lot of theory. And so I came back from that 5-week program just really geared up and excited, and just had so many great ideas, and was writing all kinds of music. I've spent a lot of time as a teenager learning how to write music. And definitely after Berklee, I was spending a lot more time writing music. And I spent a lot of time when I was out playing with bands. I was in my bedroom at home writing songs. By that time I was collecting a lot of synthesizers and a sequencer and drum machine. So I was recording a lot of my own stuff, writing my own full songs with the sequencer and recording it to tape. Of course, back then it was cassette tape, and sharing it with my friends and everything. So actually, I'll backtrack a little bit and actually mention how I got into synthesizers. It's actually kind of funny in that just as my friend Stan back in the late 70s got me into playing the piano, he also got me into synthesizers, because it was probably around 84 or so when he had got a Roland HS60, which is basically a Juno 106 with built-in speakers. And he had gotten that, I don't know if it's for his birthday or something like that. And I remember going over to his house and playing it, and it was just the coolest thing ever. And I just loved the idea that you could just change the sounds and create all these unique textures and all. It was so cool. And so then again, of course, said, Mom, I got to have a synthesizer. So she's probably thinking, great, thanks, Stan. You're costing me a lot of money. But anyway, so eventually, I think it was either Christmas of 84 or Christmas of 85. I don't remember which. I got my first synthesizer, which was a Korg Poly 800 synthesizer. And that's what I learned how to really program on. Even though it had a very difficult interface to program, it was very cumbersome. But I spent a lot of time and really had fun with that synthesizer since it was my first one. Later, I continued to buy more and more. And over the years, I owned tons of keyboards, a lot of classic synthesizers too. Just the name. Here's some things that come top of mind of what I've owned. For those of you that might have some knowledge of keyboards, obviously the Poly 800, Korg DW8000. Over the years, I've owned a total of 3 Roland Jupiter 6s, 3 Roland Juno 106s, 1 really pristine, perfect condition Roland Jupiter 8 with a DCB MIDI conversion box, a original 70s era Mini Moog, Sequential Circuits Pro 1, Oberheim 4-voice, Oberheim OBXA, Korg M1, Kurzweil K1000, Oberheim OB3, which was an organ module, a bunch of rack mount gear, Access Virus B synth, a Waldorf Micro Q, Waldorf Pulse. There's still plenty others that I can't think of. Yamaha DX5, Yamaha CS5. Yeah, just like I said, lots of stuff over the years that I've owned. So I've had a lot of experience with a lot of really cool vintage synthesizers. When I'm playing on the worship team now, I actually just use a plug-in. I use plug-ins with a MIDI controller, and that's pretty much my keyboard setup nowadays. But I've had a lot of experience with the original stuff that the plug-ins are modeling now. So definitely have I definitely have a love for vintage synthesizers, and so a lot of experience with that. So then after high school, went to college for a couple of years, community college, and then applied for Berklee and got in. And that was roughly around 91, summer of 91, I think I went to Berklee and went there for a few years. And I studied, actually I ended up becoming an arranging major. I don't think that was what I initially had intended to be when I went there. I probably a performance major was what I was thinking, or even an engineering major, because I had, by that time, had a lot of experience in doing recording in professional studios, and even doing some paid work and whatnot for studios. And so I had a lot of experience doing my own studio recordings. I thought maybe engineering, but I ended up not going that direction. I ended up going into commercial arranging because I enjoyed it so much. I had my arranging classes I just loved so much that I was doing just all kinds of extra credit work on my own just because I wanted to, and sharing it with my teacher. I was so excited about what I was learning, being able to write full parts for horn section and for all the different instruments, and just writing all these arrangements. And what's cool at Berklee is you actually have access to student bands where you would take your score to the student band, and you'd this was back before computer notation, so we actually had to write all this out by hand. We'd have the full score, then we'd have to write out all the individual parts for everybody, and then we'd hand out the parts to the student band and give the score to the conductor, who would be a teacher there on the faculty, and they would conduct the song, and you'd listen to it and record it with the tape deck, and then you'd take that to your teacher and say, okay, here's what I did, and they would grade it. So those would have been our homework assignments, but I was actually I was realizing this is awesome. I've got access to all these phenomenal musicians, and some of the musicians in those student bands went on to be major recording acts and working with all kinds of big name people and Grammy Award winners. So at that time, I was recognizing how talented these guys were, and so I was just writing all kinds of stuff on my own and taking it to them and having them play it, and just really learned a lot during that time. And of course, I was sharing that with my arranging teacher, and they were I think it was, I'm trying to remember his name. I don't want to mention in case it's wrong, but I remember sharing all those arrangements with my teacher. He was really impressed. At some point, I got recruited then to be one of 5 arrangers to put on every year Berklee would have their singer showcase, and so they would feature the top talent in the school. So they would have the best singers, the best musicians, and the best arrangers put together this show. It was a big their main show that they put on every year. So I got recruited for that, and so as one of the arrangers, we picked all the vocalists for the show. We matched up music for them. We wrote arrangements for the songs that we were assigned to. We ran the rehearsals for the songs that we were doing. So it was real big to do, and had a lot of fun doing that. So got to then conduct my songs for that particular show.
As long as I got you, then baby, you know that you got me. Oh, yeah. And you're all I need. Saying you're all I need. Oh, you're all I need. Oh, say you're all
that helped me to get a lot of visibility within the school as an arranger, which was good because when I went to Berklee, really you find out just how low on the totem pole you are as a musician. And I was still a keyboard player then, and I thought I was pretty good, a lot of classical music background, but I was really, I did not compare at all to the musicians that were there. I was really at the bottom of the barrel for the talent that was there as far as musicianship. But for arranging and composition, I was actually finding out I was pretty good. So since I had a lot of experience in engineering and recording going into college, at Berklee College of Music. And by the way, when I talk about Berklee, I'm not talking about the Berklee over in California. I'm talking about a completely different college. It's Berklee College of Music in Boston. It's even spelled differently. It's not the same college. Anytime I tell people I was from Berklee, they'd think, oh, you went to Berklee in California. No. That was completely unrelated, different school. Berklee College of Music is actually a world-renowned college of music. We had an extremely high population of foreign students because people from all around the world, musicians from all around the world, came to Berklee to study. So really great school. And I actually, at one time, because I always had an interest in engineering too, that was something that as I started recording in my early teen years, I really got interested in recording and all the technology involved with recording and all the techniques. And I remember setting up a meeting with the department chair of the engineering department at Berklee, because I wanted to show him some ideas that I had come up with. I basically put together a little presentation of a couple different ideas I had for recording consoles. And one of the ideas is basically, and again, this is around 92, 93 or so. And one of the ideas I had was what I called at the time the independent channel strip, which basically, if you're familiar with a PreSonus console, the Studio Live consoles that they have, and really there's a lot of consoles, but I just use that as an example because they had what's called the fat channel. Basically, that fat channel is what my independent channel strip was back in the early 90s, and that was one of the ideas that I was pitching to the engineering chair. And also another idea was basically the virtual mixing consoles and kind of how they were set up and the layout and things like that. And again, this was before I even knew what any of this stuff was, because even though I'm sure it existed at the time, you didn't have this kind of technology really that I'm aware of that was available at that time. So I'm not saying that I invented the fat channel on the PreSonus board or anything like that having to do with virtual mixers, but I was theorizing those things back in the early 90s because that's where my head was at. I was always coming up with all these ideas. So I had this idea of this one channel strip that you could assign any channel on the board to, and that's where you did all your mixing and, did all the EQ settings and everything else. So the engineering chair who I was showing these ideas to was so impressed by them. He actually offered me he said, hey, do you want to be an engineering major, because I can make that happen for you. But I was already pretty much involved with arranging at that time. So I denied his offer there. But and also he owned, I believe he owned patents on some different recording or music equipment or something like that. So I'm not saying I invented it and he went off and took that idea and presented it to some other people. It was already, I'm sure those were ideas already in process by other people that were much smarter than me. But I just like to jokingly tell people that I invented the fat channel on the PreSonus mixer, but that's really not the case. But anyway, that's just tells you where my head was at and how that I've always been interested and involved in recording technology. After a few years that I was at Berkeley, ended up back in Florida for a little while. That's my home. I'm from Florida, and spent some time in Georgia, and then came back to Florida. And around mid-90s, then I ended up setting up a little recording studio in my house. And for the next 5 or 6 years, that's where most all my musical endeavors were just sitting at home recording songs, using all the background of my arranging skills of just basically recording everything, writing a song and figuring out guitar parts for it, recording the guitar parts, doing the drums, doing the vocals, which I'd never done before because I really never considered myself a very good singer, and I'm still not, but I could at least kind of fake it in the studio, just as I could fake guitars in the studio, meaning I could use the power of overdubs and spending a lot of time perfecting each part. That's kind of what I mean by faking it. And so, of course, around this time, I was needing bass parts too. And since I was pretty much doing everything myself, because I'm kind of in a rural area, I don't have a lot of access to other musicians around here. So I ended up borrowing a bass from a friend of mine I was in a band with. When I was in the band with him, I would always, when we weren't playing and we were just kind of sitting around, I'd ask if I could play his bass. And I had like one song I knew how to play on it, which was dun 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 dun. What is that? Sunshine of Your Love by Cream. And it used to drive him crazy until he'd take it away from me because I was annoying him so bad by playing that song over and over. So anyway, I ended up borrowing the bass from him and recording my first bass track, and actually was using his Kubicki Factor bass. I don't know if you remember those. Those were big back in the 80s, and then they disappeared. But he actually owned 2 of them. And so I borrowed one of his Kubickis and played my first bass part, and it actually sounded like an actual bass part. It was nothing complex or anything, but I was impressed that I pulled it off and really enjoyed it. So I continued to want to do more and more with bass. And at some point I'm recording all these songs at home. Of course, a lot of the bass parts I was doing on the keyboard, but I always liked writing bass parts. And so as I got into it, I realized, I'm going to need to probably get my own bass because I'm not going to be able to keep borrowing my friend's Kubicki over and over again. So ended up going out, not really knowing what I needed. So I thought, I found a bass I thought would work really well. I thought it would be kind of a modern sound and give me a lot of flexibility in its tone and whatnot. And it was an Ibanez SR series bass. And so 4-string, and had probably bought that around 96. And just didn't really connect with that bass. It just ended up not being the bass for me. It was my first try at buying a bass, and I really didn't know what I needed at that time. And so at some point I was at Thoroughbred Music, which is actually got bought out years ago by Sam Ash. But anybody who's from Florida probably knows that name. I probably spent every bit of lawnmower money that I ever earned in the 80s at Thoroughbred Music. And they had a couple different locations around the Tampa Bay area. I think I was in the Clearwater store, which was an interesting building because it seemed like it was like a converted old museum or something like that. Anyway, I ended up picking up and playing a Fender 5-string jazz bass, which I think had just recently kind of came out on the market around that time. And so this was one of the first American-made Fender Jazzes that was on the market. And when I picked it up, and I'd never played a 5-string before, and so when I picked it up and started playing, I was just like, wow, this fits my hand. Because 4-string basses, I always felt like they were just too tight. I've kind of got big hands, and 4-string just felt too confined. And so even though I didn't know how to use the B string at that time, just where my hands were placed for the bottom 4 strings just felt perfect. And so I was like, I've got to get a 5-string bass. So at some point I ended up selling or getting rid of the Ibanez SR series, got the Fender 5-string. And that's when I really started getting into playing bass more and more. And that would have been late 90s, probably somewhere around 98 or so, I think is when I got that bass. I can't really remember for sure, maybe 97. And so by 2000, I ended up joining an original rock band playing all original songs. And that was my first time actually officially as a bass player. So I was the bass player in the band. So I went from about 5 or 6 years where I was just studio recording all my own stuff. I was doing every single track, everything, what I had kind of jokingly called 100% Brent. So I went from that to then being in a band where I was just the bass player.
Find them and then retrieve them.
this was my first time as a bass player, officially a bass player, and I was playing in a band, from going from full recording everything to now just being the bass player, and that was so much fun because it was a lot easier, less stressful because I didn't have to worry about doing all the other parts, and I was working with some good guys, really a good band. I really enjoyed that time. So that was about 2000 to 2001. I was, started off playing my Fender Jazz a lot around that time. So since I was, I'm actually officially a bass player now, I got to own more gear. So of course I had to go out and buy more basses and whatnot. So I ended up having, at some point I bought a Fender Jazz Deluxe 5-string, which had the smaller body. And it was active pickups, and I think it had, I didn't have it for very long, so I don't remember all the details about it, but it was a really beautiful bass, and it had a translucent red finish to it. Also, I ended up getting a Music Man fretless Stingray 5-string, and with a translucent orange finish. I actually got that. I took a trip down to Bass Central in Orlando and actually bought that bass from Beaver Felton, who had, I don't know if that name rings a bell for you, but he had a lot of training videos back in, I think, the 80s and 90s, and really, really good bass player. And so bought that bass from him, and that became a bass that I used a lot in the second half of my my time with that band that I just mentioned. Also, towards the end of that band, I also ended up getting a fretted 5-string Music Man Stingray as well. And and then I also had some Brownsville bass, which I just had as kind of like a beater bass that I could leave at the rehearsal place where we record, or not record, where we practice. And that was just like a kind of a cool looking bass. It was like sparkle yellow finish, and it was really cheaply made, but it actually sounded pretty good and played pretty well. So it was just a fun bass to have around. And so anyway, around 2001, the band broke up. So after the band broke up, and even though I was still doing some recording here and there, it was getting further and farther between songs. And I guess the life of, being an older, responsible adult, or trying to be anyway, and working a job full time, and you just end up having less time for music, and also you're pursuing things such as women. So that kind of starts to get in the way too. And really for the next, I would say the next 10 or so years, music started to kind of dry up in my life, unfortunately. And really a lot of things started to dry up in my life. By the time around 2010, 2011 came around, I was basically realizing I'm still single. I'm hitting 40 years old and I'm still single, and I'm just not doing any of the things that I used to love. I'm not doing music anymore. I also used to mountain bike a lot. I wasn't doing that much anymore. There was just a lot of things I wasn't doing, and I just was kind of really feeling pretty empty. And so I wasn't a Christian. And so, but for many years, though, God had been speaking to me. And at first it was, I don't hear you. And then it's like, okay, I hear you, but I'm not going to obey you. And so eventually, I guess it was around 2012 or so, 13. I remember I guess it was around 12, 13, somewhere around there. I can't remember exact dates, but I remember finally going, okay, God, I give in. I'm in my 40s. I'm single. I'm alone. I just feel like, nothing's happening. I'm not doing anything right. And so I gave myself to Christ. And so at that point, right around that exact time I gave myself to Christ, I actually started feeling the urge to start playing bass again. And so I hadn't played much. The only time I really played bass at that point for the last 8 years or so was if I wrote a song, which again was not very often by that point. I'd get the bass out, figure out a bass part, record the song, and then put the bass back away. And so I started getting the bass out now, and just started playing and practicing on it, something I hadn't done in really that in a long time. And so, and around that time too of giving myself to Christ, then I ended up finding a church that I was happy with and started attending on a regular basis. And shortly after, it was only about 2 or 3 months into going to church that my pastor found out I played bass. And next thing I know, the very next Sunday, I'm on the worship team playing. So that was kind of weird for me. I'd only been a Christian for about 3 or 4 months, and already I'm on the platform playing, which was very odd for me because I didn't quite feel like I was deserving to be up on that platform, both from a musical standpoint, because I didn't know Christian music at all at that point, and also from just being a Christian standpoint. I felt like, gosh, I'm up on the platform and I'm a baby Christian. I don't even know what I'm doing here.
Amen. Come on, worship the Lord in your giving this morning. Hallelujah, Jesus. Bless the Lord. Thank you, Jesus. That's bad right there, I ain't gonna lie, y'all. Santana ain't got nothing on us. Come on, somebody. Amen. Come on, give it up for the band. Hallelujah.
So, but that was a great experience for me.
Hallelujah.
And just, basically it's kind of like learning by getting how to swim by being thrown into the water. So in our worship team is definitely a worship team where there's not a lot of instruction. So it's just kind of like, well, we're just going to play and play along. And a lot of times what we played does not match chord charts. And there's, there's a lot of spontaneity too on our worship team. There's times when our worship leader or even our pastor will get up and start playing a song that was not on the schedule, and it'll be a song that I have never even heard before. And next thing you know, you're just kind of following along. For me, being that I was a keyboard player, and I don't really play well by ear. I mean, I can sit down with a song and learn a song by ear by, playing through it a few times and figuring out the parts, but on the spot, on the platform in front of a full congregation, that's really not a good time for me to figure out a song by ear. I don't do too well under that kind of situation. But being that I was a keyboard player, and by my position on the platform, I could basically look diagonally across and see the keyboard player's left hand. Our worship leader would always be the keyboard player. So I could see the worship leader's left hand. And fortunately for me, most of our worship leaders have been, fortunately and unfortunately, have been bass heavy on their left hand. Fortunately is in that if I didn't know the song, I could see their left hand. They're kind of banging out octave roots on their left hand. I go, okay, I could kind of follow along the song of what they're playing based on what they're hitting with their left hand. Of course, the other side of the equation there is, then on all the songs, they're banging out octaves in their left hand, and so they're muddying up all my space of where, I should be the sole frequency. So you got that. But anyway, it's been a great learning experience. It's definitely developed me as a musician by playing in that environment. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 5.5 years, is playing pretty consistently on the worship team. I pretty much play every Sunday for 2 services. Occasionally I fill in on Wednesdays. I also, for a little while, played in a contemporary Christian band, that played outside of the church. So that was a lot of fun, being able to play in different environments outside of the church, doing Christian music. So we had a lot of fun with that. And I'm looking for more opportunities too. I want to continue to serve at my church, but I also want to be able to give back to others. Where my heart is, even though this podcast, I want it to be for anybody who plays bass and serves on a church platform. I'd probably say my biggest heart is for those that are newer to playing on a worship team, because even though that was a great learning experience for me, the being just kind of thrown in the water, it was also scary at times. There was times when I just felt like I didn't know what I was doing, and I kind of felt a little lost and didn't feel like I had enough assistance showing me and helping me along, guiding me. So I will admit, a lot of this podcast, probably where my biggest heart is helping people who are new, who are coming into worship. Maybe they're new on the bass. They've never played on a worship stage before, or even on any stage. So I do have a lot of heart for people that are in that situation. I'm the type of person that I want to keep growing at all times. I don't want to be stagnant. And so I would love to have the opportunity playing on sitting in on other church worship teams, as long as it doesn't interfere with my role at my church. Just being able to get out and do more in different arenas, different areas of I just want to serve more. And so that's kind of where this podcast came from, because I want to do more with playing bass, and I don't feel like I'm doing enough right now. So I need other avenues in order to express myself. And I've been doing a lot of videos online, some training videos and things like that. Again, it's just an outlet for me because I need to do more. Also have me and my wife for a couple semesters at our church have run a small group called the Worship Blender, where we did some training too on worship. So I have a desire to do more than I'm doing, and I'm starting to do more recording again, which I haven't done in a while, which I really enjoy. And so anyway, that's my big story and who I am and my background. And also the follow up on the fact that when I came to Christ about 5.5 years ago, one of the things was I was not married. I had never been married. I was still single, not having success with relationships. But shortly, about 1.5 years after being saved, the Lord led me, once I was ready, the Lord led me to my wife. And so I've been happily married for the last 3 years, and very excited about that, and get to do ministry with my wife. She's a wonderful woman of God, and so I'm very thankful and blessed for that. And so anyway, that's my background, and I hope that this podcast will be helpful for you. So that's the first episode coming to a close here. And I know this episode is a little different than what the episodes to come will be, because on future episodes, it's not going to be this long dialogue talking about me. But I just felt it was important for the first episode for you to at least be able to find out who I was, what my background is, what my strengths and weaknesses are as a musician. And then in the future, on the next episode going forward, it'll be more of a segmented program where it'll be 5 or 10 minute segments joined together. And you'll notice that the name is called the Bass Guitar Worship Blender. And that name actually came from me and my wife when we did we did some small groups at church called the small group was called the Worship Blender. And basically we would just take different worship related topics and just kind of all throw them together. And each session that we had would just be this kind of a crazy mixture of different things. And it was a lot of fun. People seemed to enjoy it. I liked the name. I thought it was cool. But I didn't want to just call it the Worship Blender. I wanted to call it the bass guitar. So people who are searching for podcasts would know, hey, this is for bass guitars. But also mention the Worship Blender. Still continue to use that name so that people realize, okay, it's not just the same every time. Hopefully, it's a good mix. The blender mix. Okay. So that's the idea for upcoming episodes. And I hope you'll stick around. You'll subscribe to this podcast and that you'll come back for more. Thanks a lot for listening. Have a great and blessed day.